Very warm welcome from me. I've really been looking forward to meeting our two guests. They've written some of my favorite books this year. Before we start discussing the books and the themes and what they have in common, I thought we might start with the idol thing, because recently you wrote a tribute that for the My Hero column in The Guardian. And now, please correct me if I misquote you, but
Sure.
Michael Ondaatje's work taught me how to be at home in fragments and how to think about a big story in carefully curated vignettes. All his books were art, all of them unfinished in quotation marks. Now, please, what do you mean by that?
Well, now you're talking about somebody in front of them. But well, I'll tell you what was a great joy about writing that little column was I wrote it before I ever met Michael, or before I even thought it would be possible to meet him. So I was not under any kind of psychological pressure when I wrote it. I wrote it of my own free will, and so I stand by every word. It's something I think about with certain pieces of music when you listen to it and you think, oh, that's the exact right length. Like Etudes by Chopin, for example. Some of them are 60 seconds long, and he said what he needs to say, and then it's over, and then there are those that go on for 3 minutes. And I think sometimes in literature, people feel the pressure to make something longer than it needs to be, or a scene, or something. And in everything I read by Michael, I always felt as if the scene ended always at exactly the right time. Once the moment had happened in its fullness, it ended. No wasted words. And later on, I got to learn more about how he thinks about editing and about how central that is to the practice, and it made sense. And I have to say, it was a big influence on me and a big ambition of mine to not only be a better writer, but to be better at editing, be a better editor. So, yeah.
There's a line that Miles Davis has where he says, "I listen carefully to what I can leave out."
Yes, yeah.
And, it's that cross-fertilization between, I think, music, as you said, and writing, and in all the arts, which I adore, and I mean that we've all heard music that's gone on too long, or jazz that's gone on too long, but that whatever the problems with Miles Davis, he did have that real sense of an editorial sense.
I mean, one of the great miracles of history is that John Coltrane was in a band with Miles Davis. He was part of his group, which is an amazing thing to think about now. And Coltrane said to Miles once, he said, how do I know when to end my solo? Because Coltrane had the opposite problem, too much genius. And Miles said in his usual kind of uncensored way, "Take the horn out of your mouth."
Now, let's stay with the music for a while, because I was, of course, looking for similarities, and one thing I noticed is that Michael loves jazz, and you've written books about jazz music. Julius, your protagonist, he hates jazz.
That's right.
Why is that?
In this particular book, so the guy the book is centered around, he sort of respects jazz. He wants to understand it. He does not really love it. It does not really move him. And I think that was the hardest part of the book for me to write, because I have a very profound personal love of jazz. And there are ways in which this narrator is actually quite unlikable and unpleasant character, reprehensible in certain ways. And I'm quite fine if people think that's me. I really don't care. But I'm afraid people will think I don't like jazz. So when I wrote him, I had to really confront that fear. And quite rightly, 1 or 2 critics have thought, what is wrong with this African guy who does not understand jazz? It was a way of creating an authorial distance
Yeah.
between myself and the character.
I think I knew when I first started to write fiction as opposed to poetry. What I loved for instance, coming through Slaughter was the fact that I could have people say things I disagreed with.
Yes.
You know, I felt quite shocked and embarrassed at first. I knew a friend in Vancouver would hate what I was saying at that moment,
Yes.
but you know, it gives you a huge freedom to do what you don't normally do, or think the way you don't normally think.
Yeah.
That's, I think, one of the gifts of fiction.
Are you annoyed when readers compare you to your protagonists, finding similarities?
Well, I mean, we talked the other day about whether Michael is Michael Ondaatje or not, you know, and I said that when I named him Michael, one of the things that was interesting to me was that he immediately became someone else. He immediately became someone like Ramadan or Cassis, one of the other two boys on the ship. And even though I give him, rather perversely, some of my later life, some of it, not all of it, I was suddenly allowed to kind of fictionalize a first marriage, and also, you know, he thinks a different way from me. So I like that ability to kind of, you know, have him being someone else at that point in the book.
Yeah. And for me, it's yeah, it had to do with getting over a fear, which is people will compare, you know, a young man in his late 30s living in New York to me, if that's the character. And I had to say to myself, well, so what? You know, what is the ultimate terrible consequence of people thinking he's me? I know he's not me, and people who know me know he's not me. The confusion is interesting, you know. So it doesn't actually annoy me. It is a confusion. He's not me, but it's an interesting confusion because when we write fiction, in a way, we're playing this game where we want people to think it's real. So when they think it's very real, why should we complain? It's a mark of success, you know. So people have come up to me and said, "So what part of Germany is your mother from?" You know, and I try to answer them seriously, not always truthfully, but you know.
Yeah, I think with the Michael character, it was interesting because I wanted people to think it was me to a certain extent, so that they would believe the story. You know, and the other day I was reading a bit from the Suez Canal section, and there's a line which says, "This is a moment that always recur in my dreams," which is an out and out lie. I sort of invented the previous 4 pages. So, and yet that's the line that convinces you that this is me in my past, and that I did witness going through the Suez Canal.
At the ending of the book, you deliberately address that point, that this is not you, but parts of the book are taken from your memory.
Mm-hmm.
How much does memory influence you? Is that where you start? I mean, your multicultural background and stuff like that?
I don't think memory begins any book for me. You know, I mean, you know, it's like saying, would you write an autobiography? And I usually say, no. Why would I write what I feel I already know? You know, I want to kind of discover. The pleasure of writing a book is curiosity,
right? And
to kind of, you know, hey, I can invent a Viking saga. You know, not that I will try that now, but you know, the excitement of inventing. You know, most of my books. I mean, this book began with an actual incident where I did go on a ship, but really my autobiographical moment is only for the first 2 or 3 pages, and then it quickly spun into fiction. So memory doesn't really come in. I mean, now and then you will remember a cat and work the cat into the story or something like that, but you know, I don't depend on memoir or memory to be the purpose of the book. You know.
And you know, and meanwhile, in the mechanics of writing itself, there's something that looks similar to memory that's happening, and this phenomenon of false memories is very interesting. Sometimes somebody's talking to a psychiatrist or psychologist and starts to remember something that did not happen. It's quite dangerous sometimes because then you implicate, you know, your uncle in something that he never did or something. And when you're writing fiction, some of the mechanics of it is you're remembering something that has not happened, because there's something, you're drawing something out of a non-existent past. So I inhabit the life of a character. He starts to remember what things were like when his father died, and he was talking to his mother. Not relevant to my life because I happen to still have both my parents, and yet in the process of writing it, I have to remember on his behalf something that never happened to me. So that's the role it plays.
I thought that perhaps you could read a passage for us, just a brief passages. We were talking about music. Both your books have very strong lyrical voices. Could we listen to a passage?
Yeah.
Perhaps you will start.
Okay.
Thank you.
I pick a passage where, in fact, one of the dramatic characters in the book is a convict. And he suddenly appeared on page 63 for me. I wasn't planning to have a convict. I usually kind of welcome strangers into my books. And if they don't work out after 3 or 4 pages, I ask to leave. And this actually, especially the first paragraph, I began the paragraph when, and then this, and suddenly the convict appears. And so I just read that first 3/4 of a page. You know, it's from the point of view of a young boy and his friends. Late at night, after the specially invited first-class passengers had left the captain's table, and after the dancing had ended with couples, their masks removed, barely stirring in each other's arms, and after the stewards had taken away the abandoned glasses and ashtrays and were leaning on the 4-foot-wide brooms to sweep away the colored swirls of paper, they brought out the prisoner. It was usually before midnight. The deck shone because of a cloudless moon. He appeared with the guards, one chained to him. Cassius had discovered this late-night schedule for the prisoner's walk, so the 3 of us were often there at that hour. He could, we thought to ourselves, leap over the railing, along with the guard who was chained to him, into the dark sea. We thought of him running and leaping this way to his death. We thought this, I suppose, because we were young, for the very idea of a chain, of being contained, was like suffocation. At our age, we could not endure the idea of it. We could hardly stand to wear sandals when we went for meals. And every night, as we ate at our table in the dining room, we imagined the prisoner eating scraps from a metal tray, barefoot, in his cell.
Would you like to read a passage as well from your book, Open City?
Sure. Young writers rush in where angels fear to tread, like a fool reading right after Michael. In this part of the book, Julius goes to the American Folk Art Museum, and he finds there an exhibition of an American painter from the early 19th century whose name is John Brewster. And what he finds out, my narrator Julius, he finds out that John Brewster was actually profoundly deaf. So Brewster was deaf, and he was a painter mostly of children in early colonial America. Standing before Brewster's portraits, my mind quiet, I saw the paintings as records of a silent transaction between artist and subject. A laden brush in deposited paint on the panel or canvas hardly registers a sound. And how great is the piece palpable in those great artists of stillness, Vermeer, Chardin, Hammershoy. The silence was even more profound, I thought, as I stood alone in that gallery, when the private world of the artist was total in its quietness. Unlike those other painters, Brewster hadn't resorted to indirect gazes or chiaroscuro to communicate the silence of his world. The faces were well lit and frontal, and yet they were quiet. I stood at the window on the 3rd floor and looked outside. The air had shifted from gray to dark blue, and the afternoon had become late afternoon. One image drew me back in, a painting of a child holding a bird on a blue thread. The palette, as was usual for Brewster, was dominated by muted colors, The two exceptions were the electric blue of the thread, which coursed across the face of the painting like a bolt of electricity, and the child's black shoes, which were deeper and blacker than almost anything else in the gallery. The bird represented the child's soul. And this child looked out with a serene and ethereal expression from the year 1805. Unlike many of the others painted by Brewster, his hearing was intact. Was this portrait a talisman against death? One child in 3 at the time died before the age of 20. Was it a magical wish that the child would hold on to life as he held onto the string? Francis O. Watts, the subject of the painting, did live. He entered Harvard at 15 and became a lawyer, married Carolyn Goddard, who was from his hometown of Kennebunkport, Maine, and went on to become president of the Young Men's Christian Association. He eventually died in 1860, 55 years after the portrait was made. But for the moment of the painting, and therefore for all time, he's a little boy holding a bird by a blue string, clad in a white chemise with a carefully observed lace frill.
Yes.
You know, that's an amazing passage, and I think that's one of the things I love about Teju's work, that it kind of, you know, spins off a reality into an interpretation and into a kind of imagined future. And I think one of the writers that I know Teju likes, and who I also like a great deal, is someone like John Berger.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, Berger has probably taught both of us a lot in the way, not just politically but also artistically. He's, you know, he can bring in any detail he wishes to bring into his conversation. I mean, there are just great conversations you have with him when you read his books. And the epigraph that I have in The Skill of a Line is a line of his from his novel G, which is, "Never again will a single story be told as though it were the only one." So it's not just, as I said the other day, it's not just a political statement, but it's a completely aesthetic statement as well.
That's right.
That we can, you know, bring this detail and this painting to what happened to the subject. It was just wonderful.
Thank you. You know, life definitely gives one a succession of surreal moments, some of them very delightful, and for me definitely a surreal moment is hearing Michael say something like what both of us have learned from John Berger. Because the version of the story that I have carried in my head for probably the past 20 years is what I have learned from John Berger and Michael Ondaatje. And then at some point in my life I realized that, oh, wait a minute, they are actually contemporaries, where we are alive in the world at the same time and working. But it's true. What Berger and what Michael both do is to, in a very confident way, include the whole world of experience, which, unlike a lot of other writers, also includes the work of the experience of the world of the experience of art. That reading books and listening to music and looking at photos and watching films is not external to the concerns of a novel, but it's something that people do in the course of their lives. So in The Cat's Table, for example, there's a passage where these two boys are going through the Suez Canal, and they're in Aden at the port, and the character Michael sort of flashes forward to being older and seeing an exhibition of the work of
Cassius.
Of Cassius, but it reminds him of the French photographer Jacques Lartigue. And it was just exactly this kind of, you know, effortless grace notes from a master pianist of bringing Lartigue into it, because Lartigue was this very young French photographer. He became great as a photographer at the age of 9 or something in the 20s. But because he was a kid, the shots were formally as inventive as Rodchenko, because he's a kid and he's shooting people from down here. And what Michael does in that passage is compare that to people down below looking up at the ship with the lighting at night. And every time I read something like that, I think to myself, nothing is external to the concerns of the novel. You can sort of bring it all in, and then you edit it in a way that makes it feel as if it's the most natural thing in the world. Yeah.
I came across, I forget everyone's name right now, but anyway, an American a critic, a writer, who lived in Japan most of his life, and he talks about the distinction between Eastern and Western ways of recording things. And I had to write it down because I can't remember exactly.
Was it Lefkadio Hearn?
No, it was Donald Ritchie.
Donald Ritchie, yeah.
Who was an American who lived in Japan most of his life, and I just want to quote you this. In the conventions of a Western discourse, order, logical progression, symmetry impose upon the subject an aspect that does not belong to it. Eastern aesthetics suggest that ordered structure contrives, that logical exposition falsifies, and that linear consecutive argument eventually limits. And he goes on to say, so most likely to succeed in defining Japanese aesthetics is a net of associations composed of listings, jottings, connected intuitively that fill in the background and so renders the subject visible. Hence the Japanese art of juxtaposition, assembling, bricolage. Many Japanese writers, Ritchie says, prize a quality of indecision in the structure of their work. And something too logical, too symmetrical is successfully avoided when writers, in the Japanese phrase, simply follow the brush. And I mean, Ritchie's a fascinating writer to read, but and whether this is too much of a generalization or not doesn't really matter. But I think when I read that, I thought, thank God, because I really do believe that one makes something out of details, what we were talking about earlier on, as opposed to leaping in with a theme, a subject, the master shot,
and insisting on connecting it all with very obvious connective tissue. The people who do that really well, I mean, all praise to Tolstoy, and Garcia Marquez, the big formal logical progression of events. But I think there's just something so delightful about collage in the hands of somebody who does it really well. I mean, I think of Michael's work, his poetry as well, but the formal invention in the books, but filmmakers like Chris Marker, for example. Does anybody know Sans Soleil by Chris Marker, the French filmmaker, which is basically, how do you describe it? It's very strange, but it's footage from all across the world with a very peculiar kind of voiceover on it, and yet when you watch it, you feel as if every single thing belongs, even though you're not sure what those Japanese cats that go like this, those figures, what that has to do with the revolution in Guinea-Bissau, and what that has to do with 3 girls walking along the landscape in Iceland in 1950. And yet, in this film, everything belongs, and so that the art of fiction becomes an art of curation, of selection, rather than one of just pure, straightforward narration.
But at what point do you realize now you're done? Now these details, these fragments are a whole book. At what point is it the editing, or is it in the beginning?
Well, I guess every writer, once they have, I think the idea of writing as curating is a lovely idea. I mean, we all have that curating desire in us, and it's that. I mean, for me, the writing of the first draft is really discovering what the actual story is. I'm not sure what the story is. I mean, some writers know what the end of the book is going to be before they write the first sentence, and I don't know what the second sentence is yet. So I think after the first draft, okay, this is the confines of the story, and so the next few drafts are kind of, becoming, someone else in a way, and kind of reshaping and rewriting and removing and moving the furniture from the third act to the first act. And for me, there's such a huge pleasure in editing. You know, I mean, it is as much the art of creation as the first draft or the invention of the story. And I just adore that stage, you know, and it is merciless, you know. And one thing I, try not to do is read other manuscripts because, I'm this vicious man with a knife, at the stage. But it is something I love, just, shrinking it down to the essentials if possible. And I'm sure there are things in my books that could still be removed, but, for me, they seem to fit in somewhere.
Actually, Lydia Davis, who's also at the festival, when she did her presentation, talked about how sometimes she's reading other people's finished works and she wants to cut out bits. She wants to edit it, she wants to pare it down, and she's a wonderful writer, and she's also got this amazing editing function. I feel as if a lot of people think of writing as just, you sit down and write. Maybe you have a plan, but you sit down and write. And for me, there are, two invisible scaffolds that actually hold up that structure of writing. One, after the writing, is the editing, and what comes before the writing is collecting, collecting things, noting things down, being curious, and having something in your notebook so that you don't come to the page unclothed. You don't have a plan necessarily for a plot, but you have 2 or 3 good stories. You have notebooks somewhere, and you know that somewhere in this narrative. And the most exciting part is that when you're collecting the note, you have no idea what you're going to use it for. I mean, I'll give you an example of I went to the Glitter Ticket yesterday in town because I really like classical sculpture. And while I was there, I noticed something it's very obvious, but I had never noticed it before, which is that when you have and so I made a note of it, and I don't know, well, now that I'm telling it to you, I'll probably never use it, but...
well, I can use it.
Yeah, that's right. I had never quite articulated before the fact that when you have a nude statue of a general or an emperor, because that was a practice that they had in the early days of the Roman Empire, it would be the concept of the portrait nude. But the portrait was always the face. It was never at the same time a portrait of the genitals. And what I mean is that the genitals were always generalized. And this was just a small... And I thought, wow, culture would be different if the portrait of the face was also added to, like, they tried to get the genitals accurate. This is actually what Augustus' equipment looked like. And then I just sort of like had a free association of you. So a portrait of a general is always with generalized genitals. But anyway, you collect sort of these notes that might be amusing, that might be profound or sad or melancholy, but over the course of a day, you have a little notebook that you carry around and you're always jotting things down. Somebody mentions a poem and then when you come to the work that you're doing, you're not trying to be incredibly inventive only in that moment, because you have weeks and months or years of things that you thought, I could use that someday.
I'm working on this book right now, and I had a character called Daniel, and then I discovered that my wife, Linda, who's a writer, her central character was called Daniel, and I was very annoyed because he fit. And so then I went on, I found Julius. And I was literally using it for about 20 pages before I realized that Teju had Julius in 2 books.
That's right.
So,
and last night, one of our servers was Julius, and I had a conversation with, I don't know any other Juliuses, and I don't know if he's here right now, but he was really thrilled when I told him that he's the first actual Julius I'm meeting. So, and then his girlfriend came and said, well, you've got to put me into your next book, otherwise the whole deal is off.
Now, names become very important, because I was quite content with Julius as a character and Daniel, and now I've gone to search again. But as I was saying the other day, the names become very, very important. You know, they suggest all kinds of things. You know, and as I said, Cassius was not called Cassius originally in the cat's table, and once I renamed him Cassius, he became much more devious and bad. You know, and that's what's up.
You brought your camera.
Yeah.
We've talked about painting, sculpture, music. Why did you choose to become writers? Why not musicians or painters? What was it with literature that drew you into writing?
Well, for me, definitely was the good fortune of publication. Yeah. I mean, bloom where you're plant. You know, do you really want to be that guy in a random house says, we'll publish a novel, and no, I'd rather be an etcher. No, I mean, you'll say, yes, please, thank you very much. By all means, I will follow this path. But I do all of those other things. I definitely do a lot of photography and all of that. I think there's an ecstatic experience of the world that is trying to come out in some way. And for sure, yes, it's a serious profession, it's a serious craft, and I work at it. But I think the pleasure I take in many different arts is because there's something recognizable in all of them. But then we still keep coming back to this idea of freedom. And Michael probably doesn't want you guys to know this, but he's an avid photographer as well. He's got a stack of them, and he's made films. Has dreams of being, I'm being his biographer now, has dreams of being a pianist. Obviously, he has written the great novel of jazz called Coming Through Slaughter. And in his early books, there were these photographs. And very often I have to sort of engage with people who, because the famous cult author who has used photographs in works of fiction now is the late German writer W.G. Sebald. But you know, I put photographs into my work before I ever read Sebald, but not before I read Michael's work. But what it gave was this idea that, again, everything can be part of it, if you approach it with the right curatorial sense. Why not photos? Why not graphs, charts? You know, song lyrics, fragments of poetry. Everything can belong, because what we're just really trying to do is bring the reader into a space where something can happen to them. You know, I want to bring you as a reader into a space where you can experience some kind of internal shift. Who cares if it's prose or poetry or photography? John Berger puts a lot of drawings into his work. It's just about creating space.
And I think even there's some writers who, even though they don't use photographs, I mean, someone I think like Norman Mailer or D.H. Lawrence, these are writers who are similar in a way. I mean, like Teju and Berger. No, I mean, Lawrence also wrote
another
non-fiction.
Surreal moment.
No, we're not.
Teju and Berger. Did you understand how strange this is for me? Go on.
But, it is that. I mean, Lawrence. I love writers who write. Fiction, poetry, non-fiction, and all the different forms of writing. And Lawrence, of course, is a great example of this, as is Berger, and Mailer too. You know, I mean, there are all kinds of problems with Mailer, but I think there's a kind of huge variety of thinking going on in even just one sentence of his. You know, he's juggling 15 ideas while writing about a war protest, you know, and I still admire that in someone like Mailer a great deal. And it is that he's willing to use anything around
anything that fits. Yeah.
Are you able to read other writers while writing your own stuff in the process, in the middle of it, or do you have to isolate yourself?
For me, not all writers, but there are writers I will go to for rhythm. And just to sort of, it depends on what I'm working on, so just to mention a couple that I have not mentioned yet, I would occasionally go to someone like Carson, the Canadian poet, because I want a certain jangliness and relationship to history, or James Salter, the masterful American novelist. I'm in the middle of a piece of writing. It's not in order to imitate the content or even the sentences, but just to hear that particular music. But then I cannot read other people because they're distracting. Or for somebody who's too radically different from what I'm trying to listen to at that time, I will not engage with.
I find that I need to kind of prefer to read bad writers. And they are.
Please.
No, but I mean, when I was doing English pages, I intentionally did not read the great writers about the desert. You know, I went in fact to geographical journals and some plodding article about where they buried found the wells and so forth. That was okay. It was more technical, you know. And what was that example I was going to give? Totally forgotten now. Anyway, oh, and yes, I know. And one of the things I draw from, rather than the voice of a writer, it might be some musician again. You know, I mean, when I was writing Arnold's Ghost, which has no connection with this woman, but Annie DeFranco. It was something about Annie DeFranco that I loved, kind of you know, gutsiness, and so her. I don't know, I never met her, but I've heard her, and I think something, my imagined version of her in a situation,
Yes.
you know, entered the book as I know.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, but it should also be said here that, you know, Michael already has a sort of shelf full of books that he has created and made, and he has a mature and fully formed voice. And as a young writer, I'm still extremely porous to influence. It's something I embrace, but it's sort of still part of my journey, so that if I pick up the difficult but marvelous V.S. Naipaul, I know I can learn something from the way that he's doing the pacing of his sentences, or as I said yesterday, you know, someone like Virginia Woolf, to pick up her diaries and read a few pages. But I think it is probably different for somebody who's written 10 books, 12 books, 15 books, because their style is secure. So I certainly don't have an anxiety of influence at all. I have what's the opposite of, I have an anxiety of a celebration of being infected by, you know, 1,000 different styles. But I think for older writers, you know, their own voice is just so powerful that.
But I think you know, older writers also want to change their voice.
Sometimes.
I mean, last year I was reading Naipaul's Enigma of Arrival, which is one of the strangest books ever written. I mean, it's so peculiar that you know, it's fascinating. And just, whether it's great or not, you're just so curious about this personality on the page.
Yes.
You know, and so that kind of book I would, you know, consume. You know.
But I think also the further then you go along, the less likely you are to be completely dyed with someone else's color. I mean, I don't think now I'm going to read somebody who's just going to completely knock my writing off course, but it becomes sort of this sedimentary accumulation of influences to the extent that then you become yourself, hopefully. And if all else fails, you read poets, and no one will ever find out. Nobody reads poetry. So you steal from a poet, no one will ever find out. You know.
Well, often if I'm writing a book and I come across, you know, 3 or 4 lines of a poet, I'll put it into the book. I mean, not as my own work, but as a piece of poetry. And you know, usually my manuscripts have about 3 or 4 poems in there, and then they kind of fall away after you know, photosynthesis is taking place or something. But you know, those lines don't appear, but just the presence of those things.
They infect what is happening. And then in this process for me of note taking, because there's always these scandals now about plagiarism and, you know, some historian something, and I always feel for the person who's accused. Because honestly, I know what it's like to sort of take notes. If you forget to put those quote marks around it, you go back to those notes 2 months later, all you think to yourself is like, that's pretty brilliant. You know, that's not bad. You know, and then some grad student somewhere shows up and says, well, you stole this from, you know.
Cynthia Ozick has a great short story where Henry James's typist and Joseph Conrad's typist get together and they're very quick. It's a wonderful story. It's James's typist who was the evil one. She says, I'll give you a paragraph from his new book. You give me a paragraph from his book, and we'll switch them. And Conrad's typist said, but wouldn't they recognize it? And said, no, they'll think they're being brilliantly new.
That's it.
It's a wonderful short story, but
I'm sure that a lot of authors are stealing or being influenced by your books, and I can hardly really warmly recommend these two books. It's been a pleasure having you here. I know time is running out. You have a plane to catch later on, but you'll be signing books down here. Yeah. Teju, Michael Ondaatje, thank you for being with us.
thank you. Thank you.